Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another poetry session here for National Poetry Month with Windsor Public Library. I am very fortunate to be joined by local poet and writer Kate Hargreaves. Very excited to be speaking with Kate. She, of course, has been a longstanding community member of Windsor and has published a number of works, including her 2014 poetry collection, Leak, her book of prose vignettes, Talking Derby, Jammer Star, and of course, most recently, we're going to be focusing on her latest poetry release, Tend. So, Kate, thank you so much for agreeing to join us, and as well as who is joining you now.
Oh, this is Nettle. This is my tiny cat.
Well, definitely, Nettle seems to be a poetry fan. Very excited to perhaps hear a reading from Tend. Would you mind starting off the interview with that?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And for having Nettle right now. Yeah. Yeah, so I will read a couple of pieces from the book. Um, so a lot of the book has to do with kind of a sense of being isolated because part of it was written during COVID, and also being isolated based on a really severe injury that I had that left me kind of stuck in my house and unable to walk for many weeks. So that's where you get a lot of the garden elements and the sort of freedom of being outside feelings in it. So I'm going to read a piece from a section called Other Snaps. And this is the title piece from that section. Other Snaps. Necks jut forward in a coral flounce, gladioli snap just after blooming, swaying gangly at the sidewalk edge, fighting that too tall hunch louder than they deserve or can stand. You can bolster the stems with stakes, chin up, shoulders back, but they tend toward fracture. One sticky ball gown afternoon, and then a tipping point of ants. They pile into bathroom tissue blooms, opportunists for flaws in natural design, until stalks fail without echoes, time split seconds between upright and down, and blooms shrink and wrinkle, shed their dry layers limp and liminal to bury their heads in soil.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.
That's from Tend. It can be borrowed from Windsor Public Library and can purchased throughout bookstores in Windsor. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history and the process of writing this book, because as you said, it was partially done during the pandemic, but you were experiencing your own injury at that point, which isolated you within the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the process was kind of interesting. Some of the poems were written actually several years before the majority of the poems were written, and they were part of another project that I had started where in Leak, there's a lot of emphasis on the body, and in Tend, it kind of works its way in there as well. And so I had thought I was writing a project that was sort of about our relationship with our bodies and exercise and sort of the feeling embodied, but also the trauma that can come with that and the pressures that are put on human bodies. So I thought I was doing that, and I sort of hit a wall with that project. And then I thought I was writing a project that had to do with the never feeling good enough that comes out of sort of curated online culture, which I think got emphasized a lot when we were all online in such a major way, when we weren't necessarily seeing people in person, and so you just saw the curated versions of people's lives. And then again, I kind of hit a wall with that, and I thought, I don't know where this project is going. And while I obviously do not recommend breaking your leg in order to write a book of poems, I did in the middle of actually quite early on in the pandemic, I broke my shin pretty much in half, and it was really physically and psychologically traumatic. And a lot of folks were saying, "Oh, well, you're a writer, right? So like write through that process. You have a lot of time. You're sitting on your butt all day. Why don't you write it?" And absolutely not. I said, no, no way. There's no way I can do that. The pain is too close. It was too much. And honestly, from like a physical pain perspective, it's really difficult to focus on writing when all you can think about is being in extreme amounts of pain. So it took a little while for me to get into the recovery process. It was a long recovery process, like 3 surgeries later, and
Mhm.
learning how to walk again. And finally, I was able to sort of get into that writing sort of through the natural world and through that process of getting outdoors. I taught myself how to walk again, pretty much by walking around my neighborhood and by walking in Jackson Park. So there's a lot of Windsor in the book. There's a lot of train yards in the book. There's the flowers. There's tons of squirrels, because of that sort of process of kind of inhabiting my body in that very particular way of recovering from that injury. But there is also, as you mentioned, that sense of isolation, not just from the pandemic, but also from the sort of juxtaposition of feeling at once privileged and safe to feel comfortable in your home, but also stuck in your home and trapped in your home, from the physical need to be stuck on the couch because I couldn't walk.
And this is interesting because I've spoken with two other poets for this session, Rob Earl Stewart and also Vanessa Shields, and both of them talked about finding inspiration by going outside, being in more natural environments. What is it about those settings that you find inspiration from?
I think that for me, even before I broke my leg, and now, having sort of for the most part recovered from that, I'm somebody who is I'm a frequent pedestrian. I don't often drive. I'm more of a walker. I walk everywhere pretty much if I can. And so it's such a major part of my life to be outside and sort of moving in a slower way through the city. So it's also that not necessarily just a natural environment like a park, but I think it's specific that it's an urban park. It's a park that's it's not out in the county, but it is within the city. And these small pieces of natural places that we can get access to, and maybe we think about going somewhere like, I love going out to Ojibwe and walking around in the kind of the nature areas there, but also kind of reframing the idea of just walking around the block in my sort of downtown neighborhood as also being in nature. And that, I think, because of my experience moving through the city at a slower pace and at a very slow pace when I was recovering, it kind of makes you revalue and think about the natural world that's around you, and the urban natural landscape, and the kind of flora and fauna that exists there, and really appreciate that, as you move through it. And I think for me, moving through it, whether it's on foot or whether it was on crutches or whether it was, whether it's on a bicycle, in those sort of slower forms where you're not locked into a vehicle, really helped me connect with that environment a little bit more, and, bring that into the poems.
I find that interesting because I always argue that poetry kind of slows down time. You're not forced to run through as you do often with prose, but you have to take your time deliberately with it. And it seems very synonymous with that type of viewing of the environment you're talking about.
Yeah, I think for me with poetry, I really gravitate to, when I'm reading poems that are grounded in things that are physical and tangible. I'm not super connected usually with things that kind of occupy like more of an abstract space.
Mhm.
And so I think that in connecting to those very specific aspects of the natural world, and noticing those little things and things that might seem mundane or boring, either outside or indoors. I mean, there's a lot of focus and tend on, the ducks rattling in the house, or the wood crumbling on the porch, or those little sort of broken, fragile moments, or the dust on surfaces and little things that we don't notice and we maybe don't value, and seeing whether we can find the beauty in those as well.
Now, between your two volumes that I have in my hands, both Leak and Tend, I notice a stylistic difference. I notice a subject matter difference. For you, in terms of the process of writing the pair of these volumes, what did you come to see as being the biggest difference in your process between the pair of them?
Yeah, so I think you're definitely pointing to something that I noticed as well. As there's a clear difference between them. The When I wrote Leak, I wrote it as part of my grad school thesis when I was in grad school for creative writing. So I was a much younger person. I was also in an environment where it was effectively my job to be doing writing at that point because I was in school full time, and just even the sort of circumstances of my life were so different when I wrote that work. So it was a much longer process to write 10 for sure, because I was sort of trying to juggle it and balance it with everything else that's going on in my life, and working and everything like that. In terms of the content, I think that for me, Tend is quite a bit more vulnerable, I would say. I think my instinct with Leak was to use not just use the wordplay to do wordplay and have fun with it, but also to use some of the wordplay and a little bit of the body horror to put up a bit of a wall and kind of hide behind that. And as much as I love wordplay and body horror, and it's definitely still in Tend, I was actually a bit nervous about this one because there's a little bit more of that vulnerability. It's a little bit more lyric. There's a little bit more of meditation on sort of memory and place and what it means to be home or away, and how we understand those concepts. And yeah, it was definitely a little bit nerve-wracking to kind of take that wall down a little bit and kind of balance the puns and the gore with something a little bit more vulnerable without moving into sort of sentimentality.
Mhm. I discussed this earlier with another poet, the idea that there is a threshold sometimes you come across where you feel maybe as a writer, this is off limits, or this is something that I feel is too maybe vulnerable or too raw to share. And it takes a huge push to get past that. If there's any writers who are watching this right now and they're also coming across that sort of barrier, would you give them any advice, or what would you say to them about experiencing that difficulty in projecting that more vulnerable, raw writing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still probably challenged by that myself, and it's still something that I have to kind of work through. I said that, I mean, the probably the closest thing I've ever written to a love poem is the title poem Intent, and it's about this big. It's really little because it's so difficult to push past that and be vulnerable and feel like for me it's a fear of being cheesy, or being, a little bit like cringy, and but in, like, not in like a cringy body horror way where it kind of makes your stomach kind of do a somersault, but being cringy in a sentimental way. So I think for me, what helped with that and what might help other folks is to think about how you're approaching those pieces of subject matter, and why you might think it's cringy, and is it because you're approaching it in a way that feels kind of cliche, that it's been done a lot or that we've heard before. And for me, kind of getting down to what are those really tangible, physical, maybe unexpected metaphors or analogies, or ways of understanding those emotional connections that might surprise a reader and might surprise yourself as a writer as well. So kind of
Mhm.
getting into something that doesn't feel like we've gone over this ground before, maybe going over that in a different and fresh way.
Mhm, and that also becomes a bit more honest as well because you're not relying on cliches or hackneyed expressions. There's something I feel more vulnerable the more creative you are because it's more of a part of yourself.
And I think that's probably why sometimes we do fall back on cliche, because they're cliches for a reason, right? And they're cliches because it's an easily accessible way for us to express feelings that we might not feel comfortable getting to. So if we can kind of push past that a little bit and say, okay, let's get into, what does this actually feel like in my body? What does it feel like tangibly? Or what is the what's a concrete image that really reflects this feeling for me, that might not be something that somebody else has made the comparison before. That's especially in other people's writing, that's what really strikes me and what really pulls me in.
Mhm. Now, as a poet, of course, you have a certain process, but you also write prose. We have Talking Derby, and then you had your high-low novel as
Mm,
well that you wrote. What was the title of that one again?
Jammer Star.
Jammer Star, yes. I love the title of it, by the way. Approaching writing prose against poetry in terms of your process, in terms of what it looks like for you actually at the typewriter or with a pen in your hand, what is the difference between the two forms for you?
Okay, well, I definitely can't read my own handwriting, so it's usually at a laptop. And I wish I could be the romantic writer on the typewriter, but just for logistical reasons, the laptop just makes it so much easier. Um, yeah, it's interesting because in writing prose, it kind of depends on the audience as well. Because the High Loaf was a brand new experience to me because it was written for children. Um, and for sort of teens specifically, being that it actually was a new concept to me, because I'm not really embedded in like the children's literature market that much, and learning about these really wonderful kind of types of books where they're written at an accessible reading level, but the characters and the themes are really aimed at in the case of Jammer Star, the characters are like 16, 17 years old, but it's written at about a grade 4 reading level to make it a lot more accessible without talking down to the people who are reading it. So I thought that was a fabulous concept, and I wasn't familiar with it. But it was a challenge to write it because my instinct is to uh, bring that sort of poetic inspiration into a lot of the prose writing that I do, and sort of write in sort of hybrid forms. And especially when you're writing for children, it's not necessarily going to be the most accessible to write in that way. So, for example, the vignettes that I wrote in Talking Derby, they definitely do have sort of that hybrid feeling to them. And I have a chapbook coming out with Zed Press that is technically fiction, but does definitely have a bit of a hybrid fiction poetry thing going on with it. And for Jammer Star, the challenge really was to look at making sure that I'm writing within the parameters of what a high-low needs to be, and also still incorporating that exciting language. And it's a sports book too, so it needs to have those exciting sports scenes, but it's a sports book about a sport that most people haven't heard of and don't know how it works. So at the same time, exciting sports scenes that are able to be understandable by people who don't necessarily know roller derby, and at the same time also making it exciting for people who might be reading it who are in the 4th grade, or who also are, in the 12th grade, or who are adults reading it. So it was definitely a unique challenge. And the folks who I worked with at Orca were super helpful in terms of editorial guidance on that, and letting me know, okay, you know what, this sentence is interesting, but let's break it up into two because we lose the action and we don't know what's actually happening. And that's one of the things that I have to come back to, that narrative is really important in prose. And for me, I fall back on image being the most important thing because I'm so used to writing poetry, and I will sometimes confuse a reader. So having a really great editor has been helpful.
I'm wondering, I know you did mention the chapbook coming out. Do you have any other prose planned beyond that, or are you sticking with poetry at this point?
So I have a novel manuscript that I have a draft of, but because of the challenges of kind of going from poetry to prose, and sort of finding a way to make sure that the narrative is still pushing forward, it's something that's very much a work in progress at the moment. And working with friends in the writing scene, and talking to sort of readers of the early draft of that project, I've had to grapple with a lot of discussion around, okay, so this image and this language is really interesting, but where is the plot going? Where is the narrative going? It needs to have a direction. And so right now it's a very slow moving novel plot that I maybe need to tighten up a little bit. So it's definitely in the editorial process at the moment, and I'm acknowledging how much of a challenge it is to write a novel that's paced in a way that is engaging.
One last question just before we wrap up the conversation. I've been asking this of every poet I've spoken with so far this month. For people who are thinking about beginning to write poetry, for those who are maybe just intimidated or they're worried about not finding the right inspiration, what advice would you give?
I think the best thing that I've been told is to play. Play with the words, play with language, just write a few things out. If an image comes to your head, write it down, play with it, think about words that relate to those other words, play leapfrog with your words and see, what are the cliches that are associated with that word and how can you turn them on their head and come up with puns based on the image that you put down and put all of that onto the paper. Don't worry about it being good or bad. Nobody has to see it. It's just for you. But have fun with the language. And I think that will get you excited about the way that language can be mutable and changeable and active, and it's not this stuffy thing that has to be like the poetry that a lot of us experience maybe. And thinking back to the idea of reading 19th century poetry and thinking this isn't for me maybe. And that's the other thing is read poetry, but don't just read the poets that you've heard of. Look for different poets who are writing exciting works. Look for poets with different lived experiences from you. Look for underrepresented poets and marginalized poets and what their work is doing, because maybe we hear about the same poets in the media, and if you hear about poets in the media infrequently, but there's so many people doing amazing work out there, and if one style doesn't resonate with you, something else may, and it might just be that spark you need to get going.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm just wondering before we head out, if you could honor us with another reading.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much. I really appreciate being involved in this. This is
Oh,
very
you're welcome.
exciting. I was going to read a county-based poem, because my funny anecdote about this is that when I was writing it, my wonderful copy editor at the publisher said, "Oh, is this supposed to say country?" Because I said out in the county, and all of the kind of realizations throughout the copy editing process and the editing process of this book about how many regionalisms Windsor Essex has, that maybe are not familiar to people outside of the area. So I grew up in the county, so this is not in Bell River, but this is my county poem, and it's called July.
Hmm.
The shivering off of translucent exteriors, less snake-like than half-life fish fly out in Bell River mid-July, shedding crisp shadows of past selves, identical cast-offs on the breeze. Flick off your porch light or risk a swarm, freshly molted masses in search of any glow, vestigial mouths brush ears, feet grow sticky in hair, tell us the water's growing clearer. Abandoned skins collecting in porch corners, a sign of good health. In the county, they send cars fishtailing on carcasses, popping under tire treads like a fire pit, spitting embers that leave tiny burns in the too long sleeves of your jumper. The shower coaxes the wood smoke from your hair, macerates all that's between your toes, softens calluses that forget the feel of floors.
I think that is so tangible, especially for anyone who's experienced a Windsor Essex June. Um, uh, Kate Hargreaves, of course, you can check out her poetry at Windsor Public Library and at local bookstores. Kate, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I love the library, so thank you.